You are sitting around a fire 70,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now southern Africa. The sun is down. Somewhere out in the dark, a leopard coughs, and everyone around the fire goes still at the same moment. Nobody says the word leopard. There is no word for it yet, not in any form you would recognize as a word. And yet within a few seconds, 30 people know roughly what kind of danger is out there, roughly where it is, and roughly what to do about it. Somebody glances toward the sound. Somebody else reaches for a burning branch. A child gets pulled back from the edge of the firelight without a single sentence being spoken. That is communication doing serious work before language, in the way we mean it today, technically exists. And it points straight at the question this script is going to try to answer. How did humans invent language? Not writing. That came later, and that is a different story, one that starts with grain and tax collectors. This is about spoken language itself, sounds that mean things, words that can be rearranged into new sentences nobody has ever said before. The ability to describe a leopard that is not there, that was there yesterday, or that might be there tomorrow. And the answer does not start with humans at all. It starts with monkeys, who never learned to speak a single word. If you love uncovering how our ancestors shaped the world we live in, hit subscribe and drop a like. Now, let's dig in. In 1980, two researchers named Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney, working with the ethologist Peter Marler, published a study in the journal Science on vervet monkeys living around Amboseli, Kenya. Vervets, it turned out, do not just scream when they are scared. They give acoustically distinct alarm calls for different predators. One call for leopards, a different call for martial eagles, a third call for pythons. When Seyfarth and Cheney played recordings of these calls back to monkeys with no actual predator present, the monkeys responded as if the correct predator were there. The leopard call sent them scrambling up into trees. The eagle call made them look up at the sky. The snake call made them look down at the grass around their feet. That is close to a word, a sound, tied to a specific meaning, that produces a specific and appropriate response even without the thing itself present. For decades, this finding forced primatologists to take animal communication seriously as something more than noise, but it is also where the resemblance to human language stops. Vervet monkeys cannot combine their 3 alarm calls into new sentences. There is no vervet way to say, the leopard that scared us yesterday, or there might be a leopard tomorrow. The repertoire is fixed, small, and locked to the present moment. Human language does something vervets cannot do at all. It can talk about things that are not there. Linguists call this displacement, and it is one of the properties that separates a genuine language from a very sophisticated alarm system. So the question sharpens. Somewhere between a vervet's 3-call vocabulary and a human being who can describe a dream they had last Tuesday, something enormous happened. What was it? One answer comes from the same problem that, in a different script, explains how humans invented countries. Group size. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar, in his 1996 book, Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language, pointed out that primates bond with each other through physical grooming. Picking through fur, removing parasites, sitting close. It works, but it does not scale. Dunbar calculated that for the group sizes early humans were living in, roughly 150 individuals, grooming every important relationship the way chimpanzees do would have eaten up nearly half of every waking hour. That is not a viable lifestyle for a species that also needs to hunt, gather, and raise children. Dunbar's proposal is that vocalizations solved this. You cannot groom 5 people at once, but you can talk to 5 people at once. Speech let humans maintain social bonds with far more individuals at far lower cost, while their hands stayed free for other work. And once you have a group vocalizing together instead of grooming in pairs, you have the raw material for something more specific. Gossip. Who did what? Who can be trusted? Who is sleeping with whom? Dunbar's argument is that language did not evolve to describe rocks and weather. It evolved to describe people. The very first sentences, on this theory, were not about the leopard at all. They were about each other. But wanting to talk and being able to talk are 2 different problems. The second one is anatomical, and it is a genuinely open scientific fight. In 1983, at Kabara Cave on Mount Carmel in Israel, archaeologists Ofer Bar Yosef, Baruch Ahrensberg, and Bernard Vandermeersch uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal who had died roughly 60,000 years ago. Buried with the skeleton was something no Neanderthal excavation had ever produced before: a hyoid bone. The small, free-floating bone in the throat that anchors the muscles of the tongue and larynx. When Ahrensberg and his colleagues described it in a 1989 paper in the journal Nature, they reported something startling. The Neanderthal hyoid was almost indistinguishable in size and shape from a modern human one. If the hyoid looked human, the throat around it may have worked like a human throat. Some researchers took this as evidence that Neanderthals could speak in something close to the way we do. The genetics arrived 2 decades later and pointed in a similar direction. A gene called FOXP2 FOXP2 had already been linked to speech and language in humans. People with a mutated copy of it have severe difficulty with the fine motor control speech requires. In 2007, a team led by Johannes Krause and Svante Pabo at the Max Planck Institute sequenced fragments of FOXP2 from Neanderthal bone and published their results in Current Biology. The two changes that separate the human version of FOXP2 from the chimpanzee version were both present in Neanderthals too. That does not prove Neanderthals held conversations, and Krause himself was careful to say so, since FOXP2 is only one gene among many likely involved in language. But it dismantled the old assumption that speech was a trait unique to our own species, arriving only after we split from every other kind of human, so the equipment for speech may be older and shared more widely than we used to think. Which raises a different question. Anatomy can give you the plumbing. It cannot on its own give you the idea of using a sound to stand for something that is not itself. That idea, symbolic thought, is something archaeologists can actually trace in the dirt, and one of the oldest clear traces of it sits in a cave on the southern coast of South Africa. At Blombos Cave, the archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood and his team recovered two pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate, repeated geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines that were clearly not accidental scratches. Published in Science in 2002 and dated to roughly 77,000 years ago, the engravings show something specific. A mind capable of making one thing, a scratch of red pigment, stand for an idea it does not physically resemble. That is precisely the trick a word performs. A word is a sound that is not the thing it refers to, but that everyone in the group has agreed to treat as if it were. Blombos Cave cannot tell us anyone there was speaking full sentences, but it tells us the underlying capacity, using an arbitrary mark to carry meaning, was already active in humans 77,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before the first cave paintings most people have heard of. Knowing symbolic thought existed still leaves the biggest question open. How does a sound become a word in the first place? Here, the theories genuinely diverge, and none of them has won outright. One camp argues language began with the hands, not the mouth. The psychologist Michael Corballis has spent much of his career defending a gestural theory of language origin, pointing out that gesture is naturally referential in a way that grunts are not. Point at a fruit tree, and the meaning is immediate. Great apes in the wild use gesture far more flexibly than they use vocal calls, and captive apes have shown they can learn hundreds of symbols through gesture-based systems, even though they lack the vocal anatomy for speech. In the 1980s and 1990s, the primatologist Sue Savage Rumbaugh worked at the Language Research Center at Georgia State University with a bonobo named Kanzi, born in 1980, who spontaneously began using a keyboard of visual symbols called lexicograms after simply watching his mother's training sessions. Kanzi eventually used hundreds of lexicograms and appeared to understand a range of spoken English sentences he had never heard before, responding correctly in blind tests. Kanzi could not speak, but he could combine symbols and, by many researchers' accounts, respond to novel combinations of them. If an ape without human vocal anatomy can do that much with symbols, the argument goes, then the cognitive leap toward language may not have required a voice box at all. Speech, on this view, was gesture's later, more efficient replacement. A second camp thinks the answer is closer to music than to pointing. The archaeologist Stephen Mithen has argued that early hominins communicated through what he calls a holistic, manipulative, multimodal musical system, essentially whole melodic phrases carrying whole emotional meanings. Long before language broke sound down into the separate, swappable units we call words and grammar. On this account, a rising urgent tone might have meant danger, and a falling soft tone might have meant reassurance, the same way a baby responds to the tune of its parent's voice before it understands a single word inside it. Song came first. Sentences came later, once those melodic wholes got broken apart into interchangeable pieces that could be reassembled into new combinations. And then there is the camp that says the real engine was never sound or gesture at all, but motive. The psychologist Michael Tomasello has argued for decades that what actually separates humans from other apes is not raw intelligence, but shared intentionality, the drive and the ability to form a joint goal with another mind, to point at something simply to share attention on it rather than to demand something. Chimpanzees, in Tomasello's research, will gesture to get you to do something for them, but they rarely gesture purely to share an experience the way a human toddler points at a passing dog just to make sure you saw it too. Tomasello's claim is that language could only get built on top of a species that already, for whatever evolutionary reason, wanted to share what was in its head with somebody else's head. The sounds and the gestures were just the delivery system. The wanting came first. Underneath all three of these theories sits a much larger and much louder argument, one that has run for over 20 years without a clean resolution. In 2002, the linguist Noam Chomsky, together with Mark Hauser and Tecumseh Fitch, published a paper proposing that a single mental operation, recursion, the ability to embed a phrase inside another phrase indefinitely, such as knowing that the boy who was fishing can sit inside the boy who was fishing owned the dog, might be the one uniquely human ingredient that made language possible at all. Every other property of language, they argued, might be shared with animals in some form. Recursion, they suggested, might not be. The linguist Daniel Everett spent decades among the Pirahã, a small hunter-gatherer community of a few hundred people along a tributary of the Amazon in Brazil. In a 2005 paper in Current Anthropology, Everett reported that Pirahã appeared to lack embedded clauses altogether, along with numbers, color terms, and a way of talking about anything beyond immediate, directly witnessed experience. If a language with no recursion existed and functioned perfectly well for its speakers, Everett argued, then recursion could not be the essential, unavoidable core of human language that Chomsky's camp claimed it was. The response from Chomsky's side, and from many other linguists, was sharp and immediate, disputing both Everett's data and his interpretation of it. The argument is, by Everett's own description, still going more than a decade later, and it has never been cleanly settled either way. What almost nobody in any of these camps disputes is roughly when spoken language, in some usable form, was already up and running, sometime before humans began leaving Africa in large numbers, somewhere between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. One controversial piece of evidence for this comes from an unlikely source, the sound inventories of languages spoken today. In 2011, the psychologist Quentin Atkinson published a study in Science arguing that the number of distinct phonemes, the basic sound units, in a language declines the further that language's speakers have traveled from an inferred point of origin in Western Africa, mirroring the same pattern of declining genetic diversity seen in human DNA as populations spread out of Africa in small founding groups. Atkinson's conclusion that this pattern points to a single common origin for spoken language deep in Africa's past was challenged hard and fast by other linguists, who argued the statistical method was flawed and the underlying data too thin to support such a sweeping claim. The debate over Atkinson's paper is still active. But even his critics generally do not dispute that language, whatever its exact place of origin, was already a fully working human tool before the great dispersals out of Africa began, since every population that left, and every population that stayed, ended up with a full language of its own. Nobody walked out of Africa mute and invented speech somewhere else. They were already talking when they left, so here is the answer. Built in layers, the same way the story of countries was. First, humans needed a reason. Growing group sizes broke the old system of one-on-one grooming, and vocalizing let a single voice maintain many relationships at once, which is very likely why the first real subject of human conversation was other humans. Then they needed the equipment, a throat and a set of genes that, as far as the fossil and genetic record can tell us, were already in place in our lineage and possibly in Neanderthals as well, tens of thousands of years before anyone can prove a full language existed. Then they needed the idea itself, the capacity to let an arbitrary mark or sound stand for something it does not resemble, a capacity visible in ochre engravings 77,000 years old. Then, through some combination of gesture, melody, and the sheer desire to share what was in one mind with another, those sounds organized themselves into words, and the words organized themselves into grammar, into the recursive, endlessly combinable system that lets you build a sentence no human being has ever spoken before, right now, about anything at all. Was this inevitable? The pattern across every independent theory, gestural, musical, social, cognitive, points toward yes, in the way that a group of primates with growing brains, growing group sizes, and a growing need to coordinate with people they could no longer track by memory alone was always going to need something better than a scream. The specific words, the specific grammars, the roughly 7,000 languages spoken on Earth today, those were accidents of geography, isolation, and time, the same way flags and borders were accidents of war and colonial pens. But some version of language, some system for making an arbitrary sound carry a shared meaning across two separate minds, was very likely coming no matter what. Tonight you will speak to someone, probably without thinking about it at all. You will not consciously assemble a sentence out of grammar rules, the same way you do not consciously fire the muscles muscles that keep you upright while you walk. But that sentence, whatever it is, sits on top of hundreds of thousands of years of vocal grooming, gossip, engraved ochre, and arguments among monkeys, apes, and linguists about where the whole thing actually began. Some of the argument is still unresolved. Nobody currently alive was there to record the first word. But every time you open your mouth and make yourself understood by another person who was never inside your head, you are running a piece of technology so old and so deeply built into what a human being is that for 98% of our species' history, it did not exist, and now none of us can remember how to stop.